my Uncle Bo told us that he was going to Iraq to fight for the U.S. So he was a part of the military, and they deployed him. So he was going to Iraq for, we weren't sure how much time. And there were a bunch of different reactions just amongst that small group of people. My mom, she instantly started crying. She was so sad that her brother was going over to Iraq. It was a surprise to all of us. His brother, which was my mom's other brother, Michael, he was so proud of my Uncle Bo that he was going to fight for our country and to keep us safe and to keep our freedom. His parents were sad but also proud, so they had a couple different emotions going on. I was clueless. I didn't really know what was happening. And then a stranger in the restaurant, maybe they didn't have any family members in the military. They had no connection. So there were a lot of different perspectives and emotions and small personal stories just in that small group of people. So that was a historical event that I reflected on in my life. What? Yes, he's been back. So history is made up of many big events, but each event affects each person in our own way. So yes, these are big historical events, but there are small personal stories that are made up in each of those big events. So that was a big event in our history that personally affected my life in some sort of small way. So as historical fiction readers, we are able to experience these big history events through the lens of just what might be an ordinary person. So maybe in the story we're looking at Number the Stars. Anne Marie is just an ordinary person like you or me, and we're kind of experiencing this major event that we're not quite sure what it is yet, but we're experiencing some sort of major event through her lens, through her eyes. So today what I want to teach you is that in historical fiction, typically there's more than one timeline that we need to consider. So in this book, for example, we have Anne Marie's timeline, but we also have the historical timeline, and then we have the timeline of the two events intertwined. So there's multiple different things that we're looking at in order to gain a really good understanding of what is going on in Number the Stars or in any historical fiction book that we're reading. So like we said, there are these official big history events, but also smaller ones within those big events. So I made up this little example. This is a fictional character timeline that I made, but I put personal timeline because we're pretending it's the personal timeline of someone. So, personal timeline. It says in 1948, this person was born in Albany, Germany. Boys, eyes up here. This person was born in Albany, Georgia. In 1954, this person moved to a farm in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1956, this person was teased in elementary school, and they also, at the church they belonged to, they had a pastor. His name was Dr. King. In 1961, they began tutoring their younger siblings in reading and writing. And in 1967, they started touring colleges. So this is just someone's personal timeline. It's a fictional character that I made up. This timeline probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you just reading it like this. Great, this person tutored their younger siblings. This person moved when they were younger. This person, we know they were in elementary school and they were getting teased in 1956. We know they started touring college in 1967. So these are like major events that took place in their life, but when we look at it next to a historical timeline, it may make so much more sense, and we might be seeing a lot more clarity. So if I look at this historical timeline now, if you can see the dates are very close in time. So the first one on this one is in 1954. You may not know all of these things or words, but they should bring up some sort of prior knowledge. So in 1954, it was the Brown v. Board of Education is decided by the Supreme Court, and it effectively ended racial segregation in public schools. However, many schools remain segregated. In 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This leads to the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. In 1957, 60 black pastors and civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, meet to coordinate nonviolent protests. In 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges is escorted by 4 armed federal marshals as she becomes the first student to integrate into an elementary school in New Orleans. And in 1963, Governor Wallace stands in a doorway at the University of Alabama to block 2 black students from registering. And in 1963, approximately 250,000 people take part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So these are all big events in our history to end segregation and discrimination. Now, if we look back at this person's personal timeline, it makes a lot more sense. They grew up in the South, which is where a lot of this was going on. They moved to Montgomery, Alabama, which is where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and the bus boycott started. She was teased in elementary school. Maybe we know why she was teased. It was when they started to begin to integrate schools. So now white and black children were going to school together. In 1961, she was tutoring her 2 younger siblings. So maybe they had a hard time integrating into school and it was affecting their learning. So her, being the older sibling, she had to tutor her brother and sister. And in 1967, she started touring colleges, or maybe she started thinking about colleges. And we know from this historical timeline now, that's around the time when there was a lot of dispute about if African American people should be allowed to go to college. The governor blocked 2 black students from registering at the University of Alabama. That's how bad he didn't want them to go. So, obviously, this was a person's personal timeline that didn't have much significance until we looked at it next to a historical timeline. So that's the same thing as what we're kind of looking at today with Anne Marie and the historical timeline of this book. So I want to look at, I can make this at a later time so that we can add to it and it looks more like a timeline. But I want to look at this page.
Wait, did we already write that?
I did it so quick just now, you didn't even see. I'm kidding, no, yes, I already wrote this. Okay, so if we look up top, we have Anne Marie's timeline, and I have a historical timeline. I started filling it in, but there was a couple things that I left out that I wasn't quite sure where we should put them, so I left them there so that you guys could help me. So I'll read it off to you. We have Anne Marie's timeline. I have 2 question marks. I just put 4 points for each. And then I know this one for sure, because they put the year in the book, that in 1943, Anne Marie is stopped by a German soldier. We know that she was running with Ellen. 2 German soldiers stopped him on the corner, and there was some dispute between the little group, or a confrontation. And then I left another question mark. Here, for our historical timeline, I know for a fact that in 1942, Hitler recalls the German ambassador from Denmark. So we're talking about Hitler, we're talking about Denmark. That's where our book takes place, Gabriel. And in 1943, Jewish people living in Denmark get rounded up for concentration camps. And then I left 2 question marks for my historical timeline. So the part that I left out that I wasn't quite sure where to put them, I have the first one, Papa tells Anne Marie a story about King Christian. Number 2, Anne Marie's older sister, Lies, is killed. And number 3, Denmark is invaded by Germany in 1940. So these are 3 points. I want you to talk with the person next to you. I'll filter throughout the room, or throughout the space. I want you guys to talk with the person next to you about where you think these parts should go on our timeline. Okay? So just turn to the person next to you and start discussing where you think these points on the timeline should go and why.
I feel like Denmark is like a little, feels a little invaded by like Germany. I feel like
You tell me where these go. Which timeline you think about?
Because obviously, because Germany's invading everything, they can't really have privacy. Yeah, exactly. They just want to have privacy, but they're just and now, like, you're gonna get. I know if I couldn't talk to someone on the phone without having people listening to it, yeah, they're not really making it fast. I think Germany thinks that they're like lost. Well, I feel like they think that they're lost, but I think they won't. Yeah, because the German soldiers actually like just took over. Yeah, like they don't have any privacy. They can't like the German like they can't yeah. Like I know if I got my privacy taken away from me, I would not want to live anywhere.
All right, let's come together in 3. Let's come together in 2. Let's come together in want. I heard a lot of discussion, which I love, and I want to point out before we talk about this, Dylan, the point, a lot of times authors, they don't really give us an exact timeline, and they don't tell us word for word where it belongs, because they want us to discover that. They want the reader to be the person who figures out the timeline and where things go, Gabriel. So it's very important that we look at timeline side by side. We look at the timeline of our main character and the events that take place in their life, and we look at the historical timeline of the events that happen in history during the time our book is taking place. So, if we look at here, if we look up here at our timeline, we have these 3 points. Does anybody want to tell me where the first one goes? Papa tells Anne Marie a story about King Christian. Where do you think this would go on our timeline? Either Anne Marie's timeline or our historical timeline? Hassani?
Anne Marie's timeline.
And where would it go?
Probably the first one.
So, does it happen before or after Anne Marie is stopped by a German soldier? Remember, this happens at the very beginning of our book.
Oh, after.
It happens after. So this part, I'm just going to put a number 1 here to show us that it's number 1. So number 1 should go right here. Papa tells Anne Marie a story about King Christian. Number 2 says Anne Marie's older sister Liz is killed. Does that happen in Anne Marie's timeline or historical timeline, and maybe where?
Anne Marie's timeline.
In the second one? Yeah, I mean, first or second, do we really know exactly when it happened? When her oh, the apostrophe? Oh, I'm just sectioning off her name. When we have someone's name in a sentence, we want to section off with commas, just to add a little pause. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think it's historical.
Okay, so historical timeline is going to contain strictly events that happen in our history, So real life history. This didn't happen in someone's true history. It happened in our fictional character's history. So we are going to put it at one of our 2 points. It doesn't really matter which one at this point, because do we know an exact date of when it happened? No, we heard about it through a flashback, right? So it's still a little foggy as to all the details. We're not quite sure exactly what happened or when it happened. We just know that it did, and we know that it was before our book took place. So I will just put number 2 right here. And then our